Let's just, skip the whole intro and get into the topic of today's video. I hate school. I'm really good at it. Believe me, I know how the system works and I know what patterns I have to follow to get good grades and a future degree and whatnot, but that doesn't really make the whole thing any less soul-crushing. And it doesn't make me really any less miserable. And this is not me specifically being like, I hate my college, because I genuinely do love it here and I'm having a grand time. I just don't like the school bit of college, which is obviously not an ideal situation. I just want it to be known that my heat is making this noise. My heat has been off since I moved in. It just continues to make noises and not produce any heat. Now, it's always been my opinion that school does not exist to teach you your numbers and your letters and the silly little quadratic formula song. Obviously, those things are ideal to know and will help you a lot in life. Well, maybe not the quadratic formula, because I don't actually remember what that is for. But the main purpose of the school education system is that 90% of the things that aren't taught in the classroom is what we're there to learn. Those are social skills, critical thinking, curiosity, group work, the tools to research things on your own and to learn how you learn. It's a place to learn hard facts while you also learn all of the, quote, soft skills that you're actually going to use in life. And again, to clarify, school does really great stuff, and classroom content is very important. But also, the important bits of school are mostly the not coursework bits. And we've seen this come up in discussions around what special education should look like, since a lot of the education solutions that exist include having a student in one-on-one teaching for most of the day, which means that they lose that 90% from the social atmosphere. But anyway, back to the main point of hating school, yes. So I try my best not to take school so panic level seriously, because I know, as somebody who has studied education in depth, that the point of school is the social and the life skills bit, and that the coursework is just a medium or a catalyst for those skills to be learned. And that memorizing various different types of neurons and what those neurons do is a thing that doesn't really matter for my life after that class ends. If I were a neuroscientist, it probably would, but this channel is as close as I will ever get to neuroscience, despite my every effort to remind myself that grades don't really matter and that I shouldn't base my own worth as a disabled person on a multiply flawed system built to exclude people like me. That doesn't always stick in my brain, and then when I have a hard time doing a vaguely inaccessible homework assignment, it is very, very easy to convince myself that I am unintelligent and incapable of doing things, and therefore will never be successful in life. And I keep telling myself that that's not true, and that I can just tear through research papers that I find interesting, and that I, write research papers several times a week for YouTube. But we've all been conditioned for our entire lives that grades and doing well in school are a marker of your worth, and that's really hard to undo. So today we are going to talk about some of the general things in the school system that are super ableist and gross, and then we're going to talk about why being a disabled person in the field of psychology and education is genuinely quite awful, which is really ironic since, I am the walking DSM, so it should be the perfect place for me. We'll get there. Also, if you're my professors and you're watching this, hello! Welcome to my channel! This is really weird. I am using some specific examples from classes, but I very specifically tried to disconnect them from what the actual classes are. You're doing a great job, you're absolutely killing it. I love your classes. I just don't like school as a whole, and I don't like the system as a whole. You're doing the best you possibly can within the system. Also, I talk about my memory class and abnormal psychology most of the time. It's because it's the only two that I could remember taking. So, sorry about that. Love you guys. All right, here we go. Now, to begin with, we have the tiny problems that you just kind of accepted as completely normal throughout your entire lives, because that's all you've really ever known. But then you really think about it for more than 5 seconds and you go, well, that's an issue. Are there solutions for these things? No, not really, pretty much not, but they still pretty much suck, so that's cool. This list includes timed tests and work, because everybody's brain just works on command in a certain time frame, and this is how learning works. Yes, we're also not going to talk about how you have to sit for extended periods of time, and how you are often reprimanded for fidgeting or changing positions or being a disruption by having meltdowns, and we're often not allowed to have any breaks. That's really great. Also, how a lot of places really reward you for having perfect attendance, which made me go to school so many days when I should have stayed home because I was having a really hard time walking, but I felt so guilty missing school that I would go anyway and then spend my entire evening throwing up afterwards. And then we had the whole pandemic when they just suddenly figured out virtual learning overnight, and I had perfect attendance for the first time in 7 years. Good times. Also, randomly calling on students, not allowing tech in your classroom, and grading students on their ability to infer things from the text and read between the lines. Then there's also forced PE, which I also hated as a child pre-diagnoses, but now looking back I go, oh, that makes sense. Also, how some places graded. My worst grade ever was a 16% in a middle school gym class because I couldn't serve the volleyball over the net because it made my wrist hurt too much to actually hit it hard enough to get it over the net. And I was told by my teacher to just get over it. But now we know that that was probably causing minor dislocations within different bones in my wrist because when I would grow really quickly, my body would make all my muscles atrophy, and that's why I have hypermobility now. So that's really fun. So yeah, also, then we have removing points for not participating in class, which sounds reasonable until you're in an abnormal psychology class and you're learning about the specific kinds of events that cause PTSD, and that's really re-traumatizing for you as somebody with PTSD, and so you want to cope by spacing out. I don't know, maybe do the USA Today crossword so you don't have to spend the emotional energy on focusing so that you won't have a migraine later, but you can't do that because if you don't participate, you're gonna lose points for the day. I love it. It's so good. Also, losing points for work being late, which teaches you to prioritize your work instead of your health. And yes, that is why I always operate approximately 2 weeks ahead in the syllabus, and therefore half the time don't remember what's going on in class. Because as far as I'm concerned, it happened 2 weeks ago. And also the amount of migraines that I got in high school that got infinitely worse because I made myself do work during them because I had to turn it in on time. And you may be saying to yourself, well, aren't extensions an accommodation that you have? Yes, but if you do anything late, you don't know what the reading is that's being talked about in the class, and also it means that everything else just piles up and gets more and more debilitating in the long run, so let's just suffer now rather than later. Speaking of suffering, forcing students to go out of their comfort zone, like so far that they have panic attacks, just for the sake of getting a grade, is really just not the move, and also teaches somebody very unwanted lessons about consent. Some examples include forcing presentations and speaking in front of the class, as well as forcing group work and other things that I cannot think of right now, but I think if I just gesture broadly in the direction of most theater education, where the literal philosophy is just get in the shit, that should cover most of it. Yeah. I'm having fun. I hope that you're having fun. Now, speaking of presentations, the whole docking points for stuttering, fidgeting, not making eye contact, not speaking clearly, using note cards / not memorizing your content, etc. is certifiably not cute or fair. However, joking aside, I will say that there is some serious gray area with all of this because I know the point of school is to throw a bunch of different topics and experience in a student's direction so that they can try lots of different things and then choose which one of those things sparks joy and pursue that as a career. For example, being in a public speaking class that taught me that I really hate public speaking and I don't intend to ever do it. Okay, bad example, but I do mean this genuinely. I had to take a Quakerism class in high school that I really wasn't happy about taking, but then I ended up connecting so much with that religion that, well, I converted to it, and now I use Quaker values in pretty much everything that I do. Also, in my senior English seminar, I was forced to read for Eliza Doolittle and Pygmalion, and that's the reason that I do theater for a living now. A class I took first year on Pushkin is now the reason that I study neurodivergency in literature, and also one of my motivations for starting this channel. And you know what? I hated physical theater, and then I went to a physical theater conservatory, and now I have a love for it, and I tend to actually use a lot of what I learned in my future career. I still hate some parts of it, but you know, I took away so many great pieces from it, so we're gonna focus on those ones. So this is important on some level to step out of your comfort zone in order to learn new things and grow as a person and find new passions. And honestly, I don't think that we can trust everybody to honestly know their limits and know the difference between where their stretch zone is and where their danger zone is, and therefore be able to properly choose what they will and will not do. So this is a very slippery slope between giving students full autonomy and also understanding that our brains are still developing and we do need to have some sort of guidance and to get pushed a little bit. But I do think that there is a very clear difference between a light little nudge out of your comfort zone and, oh, I can see the terror in your eyes, you just threw up before class, go give your presentation now. And that line is very different for everybody, so again, it's super tricky to gauge, and it's very much a gray area that I, as a teacher, still don't know how to handle. But obviously if you create a safe, accessible, trauma-informed learning space where everybody feels like they can communicate, you are so much more likely to have students willingly stretch themselves without you needing to nudge them. I've spoken specifically before about my personal struggles with theater education and how it is exclusively step out of your comfort zone with no comfort zone to go back to, and how sometimes that's really great and sometimes it's super traumatizing. I just want to say that I am working on a series about what an accessible trauma-informed theater education could and should look like. It's going to start next fall because I'm doing it as an independent study so that I can get credit for a passion project so I don't have to put myself through as many classroom courses. I will say that specifically in the field of theater, the point of theater education is to break you down to your very core and throw absolutely everything at you so that you can learn to respond to anything, and effectively that is just traumatization, and it makes it very easy for you to slip in and out of character seamlessly, as well as naturally create new things. Severe trauma causes one to interact with the world neurodivergently, and we know this as a scientist, though we don't typically say it that way, and it has been explained to me that that's the best basis for creation, and that's why this theater education system exists. And yes, it's really messed up. We know this. I am a product of knowing this. But anyway, it is constructed in a way that traumatized cis-able-bodied neurotypical white men just enough that they wouldn't be entirely broken humans, just like enough to make them more creative, you know? And then all of a sudden you get your disabled, neurodivergent, trans people of color in those institutions, and then it's not just a touch of trauma. It's re-traumatization of oppression and anxiety, often to a debilitating point. And that is why you don't find us in theater as much as you think that you should, because autistic people do make the very best actors. I firmly believe this, but the system just messes us up far too much before we can even get to the point of making a career or a name for ourselves. Also, there's this pervasive idea that pain and struggle create the best possible art, so if you admit that you're in a dangerous depression spiral, well, they often just praise you for becoming one with your art and they don't help you at all whatsoever. Anyway, we're not going to talk about that too much in this video. I just wanted to touch on it. We're going to save the rest of it for my future series so that I can still get credit for it. But yeah, that is why theater education is kind of low-key the worst thing ever. Again, I am working with a bunch of people to try and spark some change in that subject. So yeah, because the system is obviously very flawed and it's kind of horrifying. But also, I am also a psychology major with a specific focus on education, but that's not in there because psych and education are technically two different majors, or like a major and a minor, I think, but I already had theater as my double major and I couldn't do 3 majors or 2 majors and 1 minor. I checked. So here we are. Now the first major struggle that I have as a psychology student, and just kind of as a student in general, is the academic rigor of the whole thing. And what I'm about to say is going to sound like I'm trying to, brag about being smarter than everybody else, and I want to clarify that I'm not at all saying that. I do not mean that. I do not believe that. What I am saying is that when I'm interested in a thing, I research it. Like, to death. And I will continue to research that thing until I understand it thoroughly. So that means that if I have to take an intro course on a topic to get to the 200 level, to get to the 300 level, I'm losing my mind because I read 3 books encompassing the 200 level for fun over the summer. And so I sit in my intro level class hearing people talk about things that I taught myself like 3 years ago, and I just cannot help but think that maybe I'm wasting my time and therefore the exorbitant amount of money that I'm spending on tuition, and is it really worth it because I'm not learning anything, but I need to take these classes anyway to get a specific piece of paper saying that I studied this thing to an expert level so that I can get a whole job. It's like a whole thing. Even though I've studied that thing to an expert level for fun in high school. Or even middle school, depends on the topic. And again, this is not the fault of any of the other people that they don't know these things. It is not common to have the only media you consume be completely educational, and to also have a very weird work ethic like I do. This is kind of my own fault, but also I don't want to stop doing what I love and what brings me joy just so that I can stay vaguely sane in the classroom. That seems like an issue. And looking at this from a not me perspective, if I had a student like this, I would be so happy to see their desire to learn and explore and give them further resources to supplement that intro stuff that I'm teaching in the classroom so that they feel academically stimulated and therefore more motivated to pay attention and do the work. And that has happened to me a couple times with some amazing professors. But from a me perspective, this has been happening to me for so long that I love a topic, I take a class in it, it's rarely to the level of what my interest is, and then I'm forced to kind of go rogue on my own time to scratch that little brain itch, and then I end up doing crossword puzzles or researching videos during class time just to look like I'm taking notes, that I don't actually remember how to pay attention in a classroom anymore. Like, I've completely lost that ability. So that's frustrating and unfortunate because obviously I don't know everything about a topic. That would be very weird of me to think that I do. And every now and then there are things for me to genuinely learn, but I miss them because my brain just says nope to the whole thing. And so often, I also catch professors who are supposed to know more about a specific topic than I do, saying blatantly wrong things about basic concepts in the field, and then getting annoyed with me when I'm like, hey, that's not a thing. Which, valid, but also it's very hard for me as a student to trust every other piece of information that comes out of that professor's mouth as a result. And this happens more than you'd think it would. And I also hate that my peers are being given blatantly wrong information and not thinking critically about it because it comes from somebody who's supposed to be an expert, which means that they're probably going to propagate it and make this cycle continue. I've also discovered that all of this makes studying for exams very difficult because I don't really take notes because it's usually info I already know, and then I don't know what's the thing that they taught in this class and what's the thing that I taught myself that I know from my own scientific rabbit holes, and therefore what thing they want in the exam answer, and then sometimes what they say is different from what I know to be true. And yes, this has come back to bite me more than one time. So I think that that's the basic reason why I don't like school. When I take classes on the things that I actually want to learn, I don't learn things, and so I'm bored out of my mind and I feel like I'm wasting my time. And when I take classes on things that I don't want to learn, I'm not going to be able to learn the thing because I don't want to. And if the brain doesn't want to learn, brain does not focus or do anything. End of story. It's impossible to make it do the thing. We call this executive dysfunction. So that whole situation is very yummy, but it does get worse, don't you worry about it. I just got up to change my camera battery and my left leg is vaguely paralyzed right now and I just fell over. I wanted you to know. Anyway, the experience of being a disabled person in a field that effectively studies disabled people is uniquely awful and alienating. And if you're new here, hello, welcome. I am so much sassier in this video than I typically am. I don't know what has gotten into me, but this is how I express my mixture of anger and sadness that I experience in situations like these. So anyway, hi, my name is Sydney. I'm autistic. I have been diagnosed with at some point genuinely one thing from every section of the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And also my first year of college I got really sick and now I have some spicy brain damage and memory loss that's not entirely explained, but that's okay. Also, I worked in childcare/education in various ways for most of my life, but employment-wise since I was 14. And obviously I do this for a living, which is genuinely just psych research organized by topic and put into how normal people speak. So you would think I would be right at home in the psych department, and I also thought that and was really looking forward to my psych classes until I remembered that ableism exists, and then I went, oh, this is actually the literal worst thing that I've ever had to do to myself. But, you know, I need a degree, so I'm just gonna keep on suffering because that's healthy. So I think a good place to start is general dehumanization. Like, look, I fully acknowledge that I am a human case study. I'm happy to educate and to answer all of the questions, and I tell every single one of my professors this at the beginning of the semester. There are so many disabilities that I personally remember reading about in my intro psych textbooks, pre-diagnoses of things, and wondering, what would life be like with that thing? And knowing that I had no way to find the answer to that because I didn't know anybody with those disabilities until I developed them, and now I do know because it's my life. So heck yeah, please ask me questions about it. I took a neuro class and we were talking about the cognition of face processing, and I got to be like, hey, I don't have face processing anymore. And we had a really awesome discussion about it, and it was super, super fun. I really enjoy talking about these things. It's like the one positive of, you know. But at the same time, not all classroom environments make this kind of interaction feel even remotely safe or fun, because since everybody in this field, especially the students, is so used to seeing these things as case studies on a page or, you know, little documentary clips, they rarely see disability face to face and they don't quite know how to respond to it. And believe me, that's obvious. Like, really, really obvious. We go to our first day of class, the people who vaguely know each other do their, you know, whatever, hi, hello, but everyone mostly sits in awkward silence as you do, and then we go around and do our introductions, which inevitably includes the why are you taking this class question. And honestly, I really enjoy this because it makes it very clear who will see you as a human being and who probably won't. And because the people who know me always look at me like, oh, your answer is gonna be fun, and then we all collectively watch as the people who don't know me do various reactions of badly disguised shock when I'm like, yeah, so I'm a recent brain damage survivor going on about 3 years now, because people have a really hard time believing that people with brain damage or like any other disability can actually be functional human beings at all, much less go to school and dress the way that I do. Like, genuinely, I've had several people go, huh, you're disabled, but you're dressed so nicely. This is not a, like, what? Okay, anyway, so the reasons that a lot of my classmates give will inevitably be like, oh, I used to volunteer at a camp for kids with developmental disabilities, and it just really made me want to learn about what went wrong. Yes, somebody once said that. Or my cousin has low-functioning autism, and it just brightens my day when he comes to give me a hug, and now I want to work in special education. Or I saw an episode of Grey's Anatomy once where somebody had amnesia and now I really want to learn about memory. There's usually some astrology lesbian somewhere in there who says something about how they just want to learn about how personalities work, and you know that it probably is connected to their obsession with astrology. And somebody else usually mentions how they have a hard time remembering why they walk into rooms or something and they want to understand why that happens. And then there's me, the weird one. And after I say my whole little thing, there's this awkward pause. The professor says something like, "That's really powerful. We're so glad to have you here. We look forward to learning from you." There's a few awkward nods, and then people just decide either I am very cool and they want to be my friend, which is really great and awesome. Hi, hello, be my friend. But also so many others get so uncomfortable around the information that I've just told that they just start to ignore me, or even worse, or better, but worse, they just stare at me as if I'm some oddity that they wish to understand. And side note, if you look at me like I'm going to explode for long enough, one, I'm gonna notice. Two, I get uncomfortable enough that it usually triggers a tic attack, so you will get some sort of show. But also I don't recommend it because that's not fun. Dang it, I started that. But anyway, this inevitably means that everyone knows who I am and I know who no one is, but they all feel like they have to be nice to the poor special needs kid in their class, so there's just a lot of really awkward smiles and hellos before class begins after that, by people who are just clearly uncomfortable around me but also feel guilty for ignoring me, so they do this really weird patronizing thing that I'm not a fan of. There's also this facial expression that people don't realize they're making, and believe me, I catch myself doing it sometimes too. It's so much easier to live life when people are wearing masks in classes. But it's the face that's like, oh, the special needs kid is speaking. We want to make her feel like she's being listened to because we pity her, and by making this face, we feel better about ourselves. And I do notice that every single time, and it really hurts. Like a lot. Usually it's not intentional. I fully know that. We're conditioned to do it. I genuinely do understand, and I used to do it too. But it also makes me feel really, really disgusting. And I'm quoting a lot of this from a really great article called No Place for Disability in Special Education, which I will link in the description and you should go read. But one of the comments I saw on a repost of this article specifically talked about how people go through some sort of honeymoon phase when they meet me. How cool it is to see these things in real life and to understand that the things that you're learning in your textbooks have real world applications and that these people actually do exist. And everybody just keeps telling me how important my voice is and how crucial it is that we have more voices like mine in the field and all of that really great stuff. And then when I start to challenge their assumptions and I start to call out systemic ableism and they start to realize that the social model of disability and the experiences of real disabled people typically run counter to everything they've ever built their careers on, they start to get a little defensive and they kind of start to shut me down and ignore me and show obvious annoyance that I'm in the classroom and just glare at me anytime I raise my hand. And there are so many stories of disabled students in classes talking about how they prefer using identity first language and then having a professor tell them that no, they're actually wrong, disabled people prefer to be called people with disabilities, and that they are correct as non-disabled people. I genuinely find it fascinating that this happens in psychology departments because you would fully expect psychologists to be fully aware of how their biases affect their lives and whatnot, but no, instead they just think that they're entirely self-aware because they study brain stuff and they can't be biased because they have their PhDs in psychology and have extensive experience in the field, so therefore they know absolutely everything more about your experience than you know about your own lived experience. Yum. So in the classroom, this often makes me the sole representation of this group, and that's in a space where a lot of what is being taught is offensive, dehumanizing, and often debunked science, and I feel obligated as the one person in that position as representation to stand up for the humanity and the reality of people with these conditions. And that on its own is really stressful and anxiety producing. On top of that, I am challenging the norms of everything these people have ever learned or taught by simply existing. For example, we read one case study in one of my classes that was very, very similar to my experience with a similar disability. And when I expressed how similar it was to my disability and how them comparing it to a situation where life isn't worth living without that ability, and I was like, hi, still alive and having a great time. In fact, doing better after I became disabled. Thank you, really appreciate it. My face is getting red, I'm angry. When I expressed that my experience was very similar to that case study and that my life is in fact worth living, I was told, well, this is a serious case because he's incapable of living life, so you may see similarities with him, but ... And First of all, the only difference between that case study and my experience is that his experience is a little more severe than mine, which I explicitly said, and that I am aware of my disability, and he's not. So I was able to pivot my life and learn to cope and function with it, which I also explicitly said. And look, I don't need a professor to assure me that I'm actually disabled. I know that for myself, thank you very much. But also the amount of times that I've been accused of faking my disabilities just because I am a functional human being and I don't look like the textbook version of that condition is a lot. Like, a lot, to the point where I didn't get an autism diagnosis until nearly 5 years after I figured out I was autistic. And I don't even have an explicit diagnosis of my brain damage / memory loss because half my doctors either refuse to believe that it happened or they're like, you know, the explanation that you researched and came up with seems pretty decent. You're probably right. And then just completely move on past it because it doesn't seem to be getting worse, so it's okay. And so no, I don't need my professor's approval of my existence and of my disability's existence. But also, it is a gut punch every single time anybody accuses me of faking or not telling the truth about my own experience. So yes, I am happy to talk about my experiences. I clearly do this for a living. That is why I'm here. And I think that I've coped with a lot of these things, including my brain damage, enough to talk about it because, well, I do so very happily on here. But what I continuously fail to realize is that twice a week from 8:30 to 9:45 in the morning, hearing other people talk about my brain damage in the same building that I went to very frequently at the time that I was developing these disabilities is very, very different from what I do here. So I'm torn between, do I dissociate to cope with this, or do I defend the humanity of every person like me because that feels like my duty. And due to the disaster that is this field, I'm the only one here who really can. But wait, there's more. To quote the article that I mentioned earlier, there's something uniquely alienating about hearing your experiences discussed amongst people who have never lived it, spoken about in the abstract, and leaving you feeling like you've walked into a conversation about yourself that you were never supposed to hear. I call it like weird fly on the wall syndrome, sort of, because when you sit there and they teach about the history of institutionalization with no content warnings, mind you, students are upset about the dehumanization of these poor disabled people. Meanwhile, I sit there trying not to think about how if I or some of my closest friends were born 50 years earlier, that could have been me. Also, a lot of these studies that we looked at are literal torture under the guise of experimental science. And I'm not talking about like the 1950s and 1960s when scientists really just went, what's the most unethical experiment I can come up with? And now we learn about the Milgram and the Stanford prison experiment in every single class. I'm talking about recent ones, like from the last 10, even 5 years, where they do horrible things to mice or other animals for tiny discoveries that don't really have any real-world implications. And it's just so emotionally and mentally exhausting to read. And then if you go to your professor saying, hey, was this actually necessary? Or blatantly saying, this is unethical, they tell you that whole thing about how the International Review Board exists and how no study would be allowed if it weren't ethical. And spoiler alert, the definition of ethical in the sense of using animal participants in studies is really sketchy. Like, I don't love it. And maybe I'm weird for just seeing your average mouse life to be just as worthy as your average human life, but I really, really struggle reading and analyzing these studies because it just hurts my soul too much to even think about how that poor animal must have been feeling in that moment. And don't even get me started about the true story behind Pavlov's studies. They're not cute. Some other serious issues in the classroom include using dehumanizing terms like deficient and undesired and abnormal, and pathologizing and dissecting all behaviors and ways of thinking, which is completely standard for the field. Don't get me wrong on that, but it is so easy to forget that diagnoses don't really exist anyway. Like, they're just artificial categorizations, and when it comes down to it, these people are real people with real life experiences. And so many professors that I've had, and subsequently their students, treat the DSM as if it is some sort of Bible and explanation of humanity, rather than the flawed clustermuck of a document with eugenicist origins that it really is. And that irks me to no end, because it's almost impossible to, as these diagnoses are taught and explained, to completely humanize them, since the origin is so flawed. And while professors may know this, I have heard it mentioned in maybe one of my classes thus far, if even. Not to mention that hearing other people go, oh, this kind of memory loss is kind of like when you go into the grocery store and you forget what's on your shopping list, except like, worse. That physically hurts. Like, I know that's how humans learn, And I know that I've also read case studies and I've tried to compare their experience to my own experience in order to understand it better, while knowing that it's not fully comparable, and I totally get that, but it still really hurts. It's kind of like a woman listening to a man try to explain that he understands what it's like to be a woman, but like a lot more annoying and frustrating. Because a lifelong diagnosis of memory loss is not like going into the grocery store and forgetting what you needed. Also, a lot of the cures and therapies and even basic behavioral tactics that are seen as effective and taught in classes are widely known to be traumatic and abusive practices, but they still keep happening for reasons I cannot fully understand. I'm just kidding. It's because nobody listens to disabled people. We know this. We've been here before. We got that one covered. Now, these things are taught uncritically, as if there is nothing to be questioned, because obviously, since it's been happening for years and years and years, it must be the right thing to do, because standard things are always the right thing to do. And as I quote this article, again, it's such a good article, please read it, though I've summarized most of it here anyway. Every time I push back on these approaches, I'm told I'm lacking perspective and expecting something unreasonable. Instead, I have to sit back and watch dozens of future teachers learn how to traumatize their students in exactly the same way that my teachers traumatized me. And this is what hurts me the most. I know that we, as a disabled community, and as a world in general, have enough information to know where change needs to be made and how to execute that change. And if more conversations happen where both parties are willing to learn and change, we can help the next generation to not have to experience the trauma that we went through. But instead, I sit in a classroom feeling entirely isolated and mostly silenced as offensive and outdated ideas are being put into the heads of my peers who are going to go out and think that they know everything about anxiety just because they took an abnormal psych class and they went over anxiety disorders for a week, and because they scream whenever they see a spider, so they totally get it. But then they end up discriminating against their student or patient who has debilitating panic attacks because they don't see them as a human being. They think that they do. They truly do, but their actions very clearly show otherwise. And every day I sit at a desk trying to decide whether I should attempt to pay attention, if only to defend the humanity of myself and people like me, or if I should just zone out and feel gross that I didn't say anything, well knowing that there's nothing I can do but just watch this happen and hope that one day they'll learn. And they probably won't. So, in conclusion, I hate school. I sometimes have fun in classes, and I do enjoy the structure and schedule and clear workload it gives on some level, but the academic system is not made for people like me, and it has made that very, very clear. And I'm often asked if I'm going to graduate school, or if I'm going to become a teacher, and this is why the answer is no. My last year of college has been very strategically planned so that I spend the least amount of time in a classroom as humanly possible to graduate. Don't get me wrong, I love learning, and I love having academic conversations, but because of experiences like this, which to some degree are constant in every single one of my classes, every semester I've been in school, I'm burnt out because I'm not really learning at this point. I'm just surviving, and I'm trying to be okay in this environment where it's impossible to be okay. And I would love to say that I have some kind of solution to this, but frankly, so much of this is a gray area, because first of all, the whole system is so flawed, I don't even know where to go from here, or other than as far away as humanly possible, like watch me running into the forest. And I know that my personal view of this is a little foggy anyway, because I'm smack dab in the middle of it and emotional about it. And also, to be clear, I don't blame anybody or dislike anybody because this is what their classes look like, or these were my experiences, because heck, I subscribe to a lot of these beliefs and was totally fine with this classroom situation in my pre-diagnosis psych classes. It just wasn't clear until I had a lived experience and I put all the pieces together and I realized that I am actually kind of miserable. So I understand, and I also know that teachers and professors are so overworked that they probably don't have time to do extra research or be up to date on the disability community and change their whole curriculum to be trauma-informed and remove these ableist biases, especially when your field is the core of most ableism. I totally get it, but I also think that it's important to recognize that as much as we want to look at science and say, that's hard fact, that's truth, because it's science, we need to recognize that it's just as likely to be swayed by politics and social norms and biases as any other field is. And we talked about this in my eugenics video. If you follow where the money goes, that's where science wants you to believe is true. Also, just throwing it out there, trauma-informed practices in any classroom go a very, very long way. Overall, for everybody, regardless of ability, I ask that you try to learn more, to think critically about all things, and especially if you are in a privileged majority in a space, watch your words. And if the person in the minority says something that is counter to everything that you've ever been taught, think that maybe you could be wrong. Because you could. Don't just tell them that you value their voice and then absolutely refuse to listen to it when it contradicts your beliefs. That's not cool. Even if you have 3 doctorates on the topic, They likely know a lot more about it than you do because it's their life and it's hard to speak up. So anyway, thank you for listening to me rant a wee bit. I hope that you have learned something. Feel free to send this to any and all of your teacher friends, especially if they're in the fields of psych education and neuroscience, maybe even theater, I don't know. But it would mean a lot to me to even be able to make even the tiniest of differences, even if it's just for one student in one classroom, to know that their professor understands this dynamic. That means that I've done my job correctly. So, as always, thank you for listening, thank you for learning. Remember, your story isn't over, it has only just begun, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.